a brief overview of Chapter 13 in Online Teaching with Zoom. And some of these tips are going to appear to be really basic. However, from observing educators and attending many Zoom sessions and making a lot of mistakes myself, I noticed that only about 5% of us really consistently practice these in our classroom. So many of us, and this is why I think this happens, we get enamored with our content, or we just allow that anxiety of making progress through the material to eclipse what our students need. And so these are going to be a little bit more student and learner centered rather than content centered. So number one would be being strategic with our learning activities. And so I think of this, to oversimplify it, as kind of 4 different modes. One would be that content lecture mode. Number 2 would be individual activities, where we have students engaged actively, but they're kind of in reflection on their own, doing short writes, that kind of thing. And then small group activities, and then large group activities. So really thinking through the strengths and weaknesses and the time constraints, especially of each one of these before we deploy them. So just a real quick example, I love using a ponder slide like this when I'm teaching. So to ask students to say, hey, if you could ask the author of our reading one question, or what would it be? Or what would be the most confusing, they call it, the muddiest point type of thing, most confusing thing. Or take a few minutes, and I'd like you just to write out a few different questions about the material. We may have time with them at the end of class. We may revisit them, that kind of thing. So that's really effective, is to have a big ponder slide that we engage on occasion. So number 2 would be leveraging breakouts. So small group activities make it possible for most or all of your learners to speak and process what they're learning. That's just not going to happen in a large group engagement. I was reading one study some years ago. It was mapping several classrooms, and what it showed is like an arrow between students and the instructor, and it was an arrow showing conversation kind of back and forth, and there wasn't much student to student happening in the large group. It was instructor student, this like kind of dyad model, and only about 8 to 10% of the learners really engaged during that time. I think that's pretty typical from the classroom experiences I've had. I'd ask you to reflect on your own classroom experience, and does that fit kind of what you've experienced when you've been a student in the classroom? So what happens in breakouts is everyone should get a chance to speak and to question and to interact. I found that the most important thing I can do in breakouts, this is super simple, with Zoom, before I send students out, I'll say the question, I'll give some space for them to clarify the question, ask me questions about the question. And then this is the most important piece. Once they're in their breakouts, I'll broadcast the question to the students using the broadcast feature. So I have that usually in a text document, and I copy and paste that in, and I send it to them, because the first question they're going to have when they get in the group, it's even if you've talked about it, they'll say, okay, now what is the question? So having it in front of them really, really matters. And you can't screen share in Zoom during small groups, at least not to all your groups, and not yet. Maybe that later, that will become a feature. That'd be cool. All right, number 3, the succinct expectation. So explain to your students that you want everyone to be able to share, and that much can actually be said in 30 seconds. So this is not to rush them, but really to remind them that sharing can be done effectively in short spaces. And one way to do that, to help kind of build this succinct conversation culture, is to pause and reflect. So this is number 4. Peter Drucker said that from quiet reflection will come more effective action. So before you move students into groups, give them 30 to 60 seconds to reflect on the question and jot down some notes. Pausing before large group discussion helps our verbal processors to kind of tighten up their thoughts and their questions. And then it also gives our introverted learners that more space to become confident about what they're going to share and ask. Polls are an awesome way to do this. So I can post a poll with a question that has, some different, like a multiple choice type of answer, of course. But then ask the students, I'd like you to pause, don't answer until I tell you. I'm going to put a timer on this for like 45 seconds and then answer. So pause and reflect. Number 5 is to model thinking and discourse. And I'm going to just give you one way that's fun. It takes some work, but it's a lot of fun. And that is to get a whiteboard up during your large group discussion. And when John says something, put John in a text box and just a quick summary. It could even just be one word or a couple words to remind us of what he said, his idea. And then Jillian in another box. And so you're doing this, and after 10 people have shared, now maybe you're drawing lines, connecting their ideas, or maybe you're stopping and pausing and say, hey, I'd like you guys to make some connections. What connects here? Well, what John said and what Caitlin said connects. Well, why? And then you might even type out on that line why it connects. So one of the things as teachers that besets us is this idea of the expert blind spot, that we just become so familiar with complex ideas that we forget that our students are still kind of building those like Lego blocks. And so this is a way to actually get the Lego blocks in front of them and to show them how you think or how they're thinking and how the discussion is building. It slows things down. But I think almost all good education does slow things down a bit. So Stephen Brookfield, in his books on critical thinking, which I think is some of the best resources for discussion-based thinking, he talks a lot about modeling, slowing down to model how we think. And we'll talk about one of his books here in just a little bit. But let's move on to number 6. And this would probably be my top recommendation, my number 1 tip. So I should have saved this to the end instead of putting it in the middle. In the book, I compare conversation in the Zoom environment or video conference environment as to a police officer who's out in the middle of the road directing traffic at a really busy intersection. So if she's hesitant or unclear, the interplay comes to a halt, right? So I'd like to read just a portion of that book segment. Because most of us want to be accommodating and considerate, a more directive style of leadership can feel overbearing or autocratic. However, we can be assertive and polite at the same time. So a colleague of mine explains this well. He says, I encourage my students to speak up, interrupt me at times, and I want to make sure everyone is willing and motivated to have their voice heard. If this doesn't occur, then the classroom becomes a jumble of students unmuting, saying something, me replying, students muting again, and everyone staring at each other, waiting for someone to unmute and say something. So that assertiveness in our leadership, directing the traffic and the conversation, makes all the difference for learners in this environment. Number 7, calling on students by name. This is probably the most accessible and underrated practice for creating a positive classroom culture of engagement and interaction. I remember observing a classroom, and I just noticed how often the instructor called on students. And he had, in that particular class, it was in an on-campus class, but we also had on-Zoom learners. And it really is what helped to integrate the two, is by calling on students kind of back and forth from both places and connecting the conversation. So just think for a moment about the difference between a classroom experience where an instructor calls on maybe 2 or 3, just a handful of students in the course of an hour versus 10 to 15 or 20. That really keeps students on their toes. When someone calls on me, I think they're implicitly placing value on my thoughts, and it also communicates that my contribution matters to the learning community. So this is really powerful for creating culture. But some of us have concerns that this puts students on the spot, and that could be true if it's an ad hoc practice. But there's some great some great resources I'd like to share with you. So let me drag this across here. There we go. So Harvard's instructional moves site, so it's instructionalmoves.gse.harvard.edu, or you could just Google instructional moves and it should pop up. Has some great stuff on cold calling. So this one right here is on calling on students in equitable ways. It's going to have a short video, but you're also going to see some relevant research and a few related resources. And then this is one just on cold calling right here. And then they have an article, I believe, on cold calling as well. Yeah, there should be like a whole journal article in here on some work that they've done. And so I'd recommend that to you. So calling on students by name. Number 8, use communication protocols. So this has been a real help to me, but just such things as if you were the last one to speak, allow 2 other people to speak before you speak again. Or everyone in your group should share, even if it's brief. I know we've only got 4 minutes, but I'd like you all to share. In this discussion, I would like two of you to team up to just ask questions or take notes or that kind of thing. In our next discussion, I'd like to hear from those who have yet to share. And that's a great one to forecast ahead of time, especially in the large group context. That way they can prepare, because it's going to usually be folks who are a little more hesitant. I'd like for us to return to ideas from the first segment of class in this conversation. So a lot of different types of protocols. Some great protocols can be found in Brookfield and Preskill's book, The Discussion Book, 50 Great Ways to Get People Thinking. I don't know why it only has 47 ratings. It's absolutely fantastic. It's one of those ones that you'll keep on your desk, so I would highly recommend it. All right, number 9, sharpen your large group skills. So I'm going to read just a short segment from my book, and then I'm going to share an idea with you that I think is more valuable than any book you could probably read. Facilitating large group discussion is a demanding task and requires a skill set that includes rephrasing, summarizing, gently interrupting, connecting ideas, thanking and appreciating, using names, giving space to think, pacing the conversation, concluding, and transitioning. These are all skills that we can sharpen. And probably the best way, here's that recommendation, and that is to set up a time with another instructor, someone that you really appreciate. You would consider a master teacher, someone who's teaching via Zoom, or just getting into their classroom and observe them and what they're doing. And ask them, let them know, like, hey, I'd love to see you demonstrate some of your large group interaction skills. All right, the last one, acknowledging the limitations of conversation. The thesis of online teaching with Zoom is that video conferencing technology was created for dialogue, not content delivery. So if we're doing all content delivery like this video and not interacting, then we're really working against the technology, against this type of online classroom. And so part 3 of the book focuses on this idea of how do you augment communication, lecture type instruction with about every 10 to 15 minutes, really focused sessions of active learning. But I've seen students get frustrated, particularly when you start a conversation and it feels like it's just getting going, and then you have to like hit the brakes and move on to the next thing. Once students start to talk, a lot of times they want to keep going. So the best thing to do, this is a simple practice, is just to forecast that and say, hey, listen, we're going to jump into probably 6 or 7 short learning activities. You're going to be talking in small groups. And in a lot of cases, you're going to feel like you just got started. And then we're going to move on to the next thing. So just forecasting it makes all the difference in the world. But if students are holding on to this expectation that they're going to really dig deep, then and that becomes really difficult. So the next part in online teaching with Zoom addresses that you may start realizing that your students do want to go into deeper critical thinking, that you want to lead them into more collaborative activities. And that's where you start making a switch into more team-based work, where you're doing a majority of your class time instead of in lecture, you're moving it into small group breakouts. So those are the 10 tips for facilitating active learning in Zoom.